Mr. Speaker, members of this august body, permit me at the outset to thank and congratulate all the members of the opposition on their contribution. It will be remiss of me if I don't do the same thing for the government, so I do. Mr. Speaker, when this recent crisis with Venezuela began, I got a call from the president for a briefing on the issue. And I said to him at the time that he can be reassured that the opposition will support the government on this issue of the Guyana and Venezuela territorial controversy. Mr. Speaker, politically we have fought for years, but one reality that we should be proud of is that throughout the history of our country, we have always been united on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy. For us to even consider fighting over political power, we must first own our country. There will be nothing to fight for if we are not united in defense of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the motion before the House today, confident that I'm uniquely qualified to do so. Firstly, I'm a proud Guyanese who believes that every square inch of this country belongs to the people of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, our ancestors, those who were here before Columbus, those who came from Europe, Africa, and India, fought hard in difficult circumstances to create a human landscape which allowed us over more than 350 years to make Guyana what it is today. Secondly, I have also been a member of the Guyana Foreign Service and have been able to witness at first hand the constant aggression of Venezuela and how the instructions of the ministry and the rest of the government fashion a response at various times. But Mr. Speaker, we inherited this land. It is our inheritance, and we will do everything to protect that inheritance. Despite our difficulties, our differences, political and otherwise, we have fashioned a society that is politically dynamic, culturally rich, and with great economic potential. I concede that creating this country and society has not been an easy task. The Africans, according to our great history, later joined by our Indian brothers, moved tons of soil to build our coastline and where most of our people live, work, and struggle to fashion a place where our people could live and create the environment for meaningful human existence. All of our people contributed to the creation of the emerging and emergent society, which saw the development of professionals, artists, cricketers, writers, dynamic entrepreneurs, celebrated scholars, and a people who have a reputation of being intellectually gifted. I do believe we have the intellectual capacity to take on Venezuela. All our people must benefit from our national patrimony. That's our reality. Mr. Speaker, as we develop, our people yearn for the freedom to build our own society and create our own destiny. As a people, it is not by accident our motto is one people, one nation, one destiny. It's a manifestation of our aspirations. And therefore we are obligated to work to bring it to fruition. Many contributed to this great experiment, including our own Forbes Burnham and Chedi Jagan, both of whom were distinguished members of this House. Political freedom eventually came in 1966. Even though it is hard to accept, that freedom was qualified by threats to our territorial integrity and sovereignty by our neighbors. I think that of all the colonial territories which have gained independence, none have reached that milestone, with neighboring countries making substantial claims to its national patrimony. Unfortunately, Guyana finds itself in that position. But as we all know, both Suriname and Venezuela cast covetous eyes on our land. In other words, the hard work that we as a people had put in to the creation of a country and society was going to be taken away from us. We must never permit that. That will not happen. Of the two claims to our land, by far the more sinister and persistent would come from our neighbors to the west, Venezuela. I am sure that this Honorable House will bear with me as I briefly recount the background to this threat to our territorial integrity. Might I say, we must not tire of learning about this threat. Our children need to know. Our people need to know. The background history must become our catechism. We must understand and inwardly digest the fact that all we have achieved, indeed our way of life, is threatened by the persistent greed of our western neighbor, Venezuela. This is a threat like no other. Venezuela seeks our entire Essequibo region, our richest county. Let me quote one of our former diplomats, Dr. Ishmael, the author of the Trail of Diplomacy. He said the following in the second volume of his book, and I quote, "The part claimed by Venezuela is extremely rich in forests, water, and mineral resources. For instance, the Maraca Mountain range, extending into both Guyana and Venezuela, has huge deposits of iron ore. In addition, manganese deposits are located in the northwest district of Guyana, while gold and diamonds, among other minerals, are found in the Barima, Mazaruni, Cayuni, and Putaro districts. In addition, we know that we have oil because oil has been found by ExxonMobil and other major oil companies. Guyana cannot afford to lose this treasure. Recent discovery and production of oil have resulted in an intensification of Venezuela's greed." Mr. Speaker, permit me to turn to the background to what we now refer to as the territorial controversy. In the 19th century stood the mighty British Empire and the emergent United States of America. The latter's economic development was so rapid that it will overtake the economic strength of the former by the turn of the early 20th century. And like any state which was becoming powerful, it wanted to set rules for the area in which it would dominate. In 1823, therefore, the American government promulgated the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine said essentially that no European power would be allowed to dominate the American continent. This worked in Venezuela's favor just after it had won its independence from Spain. Venezuela found itself in contest with the British Empire over the frontier with the British colony of British Guyana. The British government therefore sent one of its explorers to determine the boundary between its colony and the Republic of Venezuela. The explorer was a man called Chamberg. He demarcated the boundary line between the Republic of Venezuela and British Guyana in 1840. The Venezuelans were not satisfied with this boundary, especially after there was a suggestion that gold was found in the area between itself and British Guyana. Even at this time, greed demanded urgency. The Venezuelan appealed to Americans to compel the British to open discussions on the boundary between itself and the British Empire. I want that to sink in, that it is Venezuela engaging the Americans, and then it happened. Please pay close attention to what is happening here, because Caracas in later years would claim erroneously that it was not represented on the 1899 arbitral tribunal when it asked American lawyers to do its representation. Indeed, it can be said that throughout the demanding and challenging period of the controversy between Guyana and Venezuela, there would be a slew of mistruths on the part of Caracas, from the dismissal of the significance of the 1899 arbitral award to the true historical meaning of the 1966 Geneva Agreement. It has also sent up a cloud of misinformation when it is caught violating our territorial integrity. In the words of a British statesman, the representatives of the Republic of Venezuela often were economical with the truth. I take up once again the thread of my presentation by stating that in the face of credible threats from the United States, and the reality that the United States had appointed a commission to demarcate the border between British Guyana and Venezuela, the British agreed to the Treaty of Washington of 1897. This treaty is important for many reasons, but its enduring significance must be that in creating the 1899 arbitral tribunal, it stated explicitly that the decision of the tribunal will represent, I quote, full, final, and perfect settlement of all matters referred to it. The Venezuelan government of the time signed on to this agreement, and that must be established. A subsequent Venezuelan government also agreed to the demarcation of the border between British Guyana by participating in the established Boundary Commission in 1905. To this end, Cedric Joseph noted in his book, Anglo-American Diplomacy and the Reopening of the Guyana-Venezuela Boundary Controversy, 1961 to 1966, that, I quote, the implementation of the award by the two parties, Britain and Venezuela, followed without any due delay. From late 1900 to early 1905, an Anglo-Venezuelan Boundary Commission marked on the ground the boundary defined by the arbitral award. The Joint Commission identified the geographical position of 25 boundary markers, unquote. Caracas was to repudiate the 1899 award and the legitimacy of the border between our two countries without any justification. This is a matter of significance in the relations between our two countries. This refusal to honor agreements solemnly arrived at must warrant both study and condemnation. Let me say a few words about this disturbing behavior about an important state in the Latin America and Caribbean region. This refusal to honor agreements is likely to pose a serious threat to peace and stability of the Latin American and Caribbean region. Mr. Speaker, as a student of politics and international relations, I have been intrigued by Venezuela's almost casual disregard for international agreements as far as Guyana is concerned. I have therefore examined Venezuela's behavior over the decades, and I have come to the conclusion that its flouting of international norms and mores is a mechanism to facilitate its geopolitical ambitions. That Caracas has strategic ambitions in the Caribbean is beyond dispute. As early as 1955, it had proposed that certain Caribbean states should be handed over to it. Sometimes we forget that Venezuela said very early certain Caribbean states should be handed over. And in the mixed commission created by the 1966 Geneva Agreement, Venezuela proposed the joint development of the Essequibo. Is our population aware of this and its significance? Are some of our politicians aware of this? We cannot concede an inch to Venezuela. They have always come up with some backdoor means to get at our territory. We must see Venezuela as an adversary that wants our territory. We must remember that Venezuela always comes up with some scheme to get our territory. We have to be ever vigilant. Is it in this context I want to say to the Minister of Foreign Affairs that you close by suggesting that the ruling of the ICJ will end Venezuela's aggression. I want to caution, if one follows the history of Venezuela, that is not likely possible. In fact, if one looks at what is happening, one sees that Venezuela is preparing the pitch to be able to say, we accept it. So we have to now look at the options. We have to be careful not to create a false mood that Venezuela, that once the ruling comes, Venezuelan aggression will end. I just think it might take different forms. We cannot concede an inch to Venezuela. I repeat, we must see Venezuela as an adversary that wants our territory. We must remember that Venezuela always comes up with some scheme. I pause here to tell you what the late Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and one of the world's greatest historians said in addressing the General Council of his party in 1976. Dr. Eric Williams said, and I quote, "This is an official proposal of the government of Venezuela for the joint development of the disputed region, which constituted in effect a total economic and cultural takeover of the disputed zone." Trinidad. Mr. Burnham, the late leader of our party, also a man of strategic insight, said at the summit conference of CARICOM states held in Jamaica in 1982 that the threat to Guyana represented a threat to the entire Caribbean community. I believe this is a message we must carry to the Caribbean community. He went on to say that if Guyana loses 5/8 of its territory, CARICOM would be greatly diminished. Lastly, and in this context, we must keep at the front of our minds that Venezuela has already taken over Bird Island, which was once owned by Dominica, and has made inroads into the Eastern Caribbean states through the mechanism of Petro-Caribe, and economic largesse had made inroads into our support among these states. It is in this context I want to recommend to this House that the government should develop a proper system of sending envoys to engage these Caribbean leaders so that outside of the general CARICOM support, we can regain and maintain the support of their individual countries. It is critical. Only recently, a Caribbean politician called on Guyana and Venezuela to ensure that the Caribbean remains a zone of peace. I could not believe that. I could not believe that, honestly. I cannot accept that a Caribbean sister state will cast us in that kind of light. But they haven't said that. Are we to conclude that Guyana has threatened the territorial integrity and sovereignty of any state in the Caribbean? We never did. Have we issued decrees to take over another state's maritime space? We never did. Have we rejected the decisions of any international tribunal? We never did. It was Venezuela that did. And therefore, to say Guyana and Venezuela must ensure a zone of peace is classic impasse, because we have always maintained that there must be the peaceful resolution of this matter. And it is really disturbing that, I didn't call name, it is really disturbing that a Caribbean nation can say that and implicate Guyana when Guyana basically lacked the means militarily to even conceptualize that approach, much less implement it. And so I think it is necessary that the opposition put on record that we disagree totally with that position. I think I have made the point that we are dealing with a dangerous and sinister enemy in the form of the Venezuelan state. And we will have to take measures not only to defend our territorial integrity and sovereignty, but also our place in the Latin America and Caribbean region. We need to hurtle to take action to do that. Clearly, there is a need for a more robust and aggressive foreign policy vis-a-vis Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Speaker, I hope I have belabored the point that when states such as Venezuela do not fully honor agreements, and in time, tension ensues. And so if there's any tension in this part of the world, it has been created by the aggressiveness of Venezuela. But I cannot leave this part of my presentation without observing that Venezuela has proved to be nothing but a regional bully. And I say that and will qualify it, a regional bully of small states. The 1899 Arbitral Award was the basis of the Tri-Junction Point, which fixed the boundaries for Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil. In this exercise, Caracas lost territory to Brazil. I repeat that. In this exercise, Caracas lost territory to Brazil, but has never once contested the legitimacy of the award with Brasilia. And that says to you that they are not only a regional bully, they are specifically targeting small states such as Guyana. Yet it has done so with the smallest state of Guyana. It reminds me one of the millennial dialogues in the 5th century, where the great historian Thucydides made the Greeks say during the Peloponnesian War, tell the lowly Melians that the powerful have the right to rule the weakest state. We say no. We say that our Western neighbor is mistaken in the belief that Guyana will succumb to its bullyism and its attempt to take over our land and its riches. We will not. We will never. Mr. Speaker, I want here to speak to the recapitalization of the Ghana Defense Force. We have always been a weak state. I don't think we can take on Venezuela. But it is very important that we keep a ready force that instills hope in our people. I remember in the 70s, we boasted of how we were better than them in jungle warfare. Let us not operate as if we can do nothing outside of diplomacy. We have to take every measure to deal with this issue. After having accepted the 1899 arbitral award and the legitimacy of the frontier between Guyana and itself, Venezuela suddenly decided in 1962 to overthrow it based on the infamous Malé-Provo Memorandum. Venezuela made its claim at the UN. We must pay careful attention. Venezuela made its claim at the UN, and the British government, to allow the principle of justice to prevail, agreed to a re-examination of the document in relation to the territorial controversy for Caracas to have the opportunity to prove the nullity of the 1899 arbitral award. I want us to understand what is happening here. Went to the UN, and the UN indicated that they must be able to prove it. Of course, you know, they never did, and will never ever be able to. However, the British government, in making this concession to re-examine the documents, said clearly that it was standing by the validity of that arbitral award. What that means is that our border with Venezuela was settled by the arbitral award of 1899, and there is no border dispute. There is no border dispute. And that a controversy emerged based on the Malé-Provo spurious claim that there was a deal that caused Venezuela to lose territory. It is very important for us to understand that. And that is why I feel offended when I hear people talking about Guyana, Venezuela, border problem and border dispute. There isn't any dispute over a border. It was settled. There's a controversy that emerged over the Malé-Provo claim. Until this day, nothing was proved. Mr. Speaker, it is useful to note here the language used in Article 1 of the Geneva Agreement, and I quote, "A mixed commission shall be established with the task of seeking satisfactory solutions for the practical settlement of the controversy." No border dispute of the controversy between Venezuela and the United Kingdom, which has arisen as a result of the contention that the arbitral award of 1899 about the frontiers between British Guyana and Venezuela is null and void, unquote. I think we need to let all our children know that we do not have a border dispute with Venezuela. Our borders were settled. And in the interest of justice, the British agreed at the UN to reopen it for the facts to be produced. The examination of the documents led to the meetings in Geneva between the representatives of British Guyana, the representative of the British government, and the representative of Venezuela. They met for a two-day conference on February 16th and 17th, 1966. The Geneva Agreement consists of 8 articles, the most important of which can be said to be Article 4.2, which gives the United Nations Secretary General the right to choose a means of settlement. Also, it created the Mixed Commission, which met for 4 years until 1970. Here again, the conduct of Caracas at this period, was one in extremely bad taste. We see Venezuela talking about the settlement should come from the Geneva Agreement. We should be saying to Venezuela that we are at the International Court of Justice. It's as a result of the Geneva Agreement. The Mixed Commission gave the Venezuelan government the opportunity to prove the nullity of the 1899 award. It never did, and it cannot. Instead, it made claims to the Essequibo and proposed its joint development. Venezuela did more than this. It displayed naked aggression, even as the Commission met, by seizing the eastern half of Ancolo Island, which belonged to Guyana, and fostered the Rupununi Rebellion of 1969. This created great difficulties for the newly independent Guyana. But I say to you, in every negative, there is always a positive. Venezuela's aggression steeled this nation and made us more hardened and more experienced to take on the challenges of national development, and skillful at honing the available diplomatic and national security instruments for the survival of this nation. This opportunity is taken to record our appreciation of all those who played a role in laying the foundation and developing a diplomatic and national security framework to protect our interests and our sovereignty. Mr. Speaker, too regularly we do not put in our records many of the people who contributed. We have heard of Bernard. We have heard of Dr. Jagan. All of them have contributed. But I wanted to say special thanks to these people. Sir Sridhar Ramphal, Fred Wills, Hamilton Green, Rashley Jackson, David Granger, who contributed both as diplomat and soldier, Carl Greenwich, Clement Rohi, Barton Scotland, Ralph and Boise Ramkaran, Lloyd Sewell, Winston Murray, Rudy Ensenali, Ronald Austin Sr., Rudy Collins, Tyrone Ferguson, and the one who probably would have written the most, Cedric Joseph. Well, I mentioned Odin, book and so already. As I gotta go back and mention Bonham Jagan again. Mr. Speaker, the terms of the Mixed Commission ended in 1970. Fortunately, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, used his good offices to broker the Protocol of Port of Spain, which froze the border controversy for 12 years. This deserves our appreciation and commendation, since it was the European and American statesmen who fashioned agreements to resolve our problems and disputes. And therefore, it was the first time we did it ourselves in the Caribbean when Eric Williams led it. The protocol was ratified by Venezuela Congress. But the relation with our Western neighbor was never peaceful. On his visit to Guyana in 1978, Carlos Andres Perez proposed a symbolic cession of territory to Venezuela, but this was firmly rejected by Guyana under Forbes Burnham. This must be a lesson to those modern-day politicians who are transactionalists and seem not to appreciate that we must not cede 1 inch of what belongs to us. The decade of the 70s were to prove more Pacific than that of the 80s. President Burnham was invited to Venezuela on a state visit, and at the end of it, President Herrera Campins, who had been a member of the Mixed Commission, bluntly refused to renew the Protocol of Port of Spain. This unleashed Venezuelan economic, military, and diplomatic aggression against Guyana, which was summarized in the budget presentation by the then Finance Minister, Frank Hope, to the National Assembly, in which he stated, and I quote, "The Venezuelan government has not only intensified its economic pressures against us in pursuit of its spurious claim to our land, but it has also been indulging in dangerous adventurism, in violating our airspace, our territorial integrity. During the past year, there were over 80 violations of our airspace by Venezuelan aircraft. The aircraft penetrated as far as Timeri, as they tried desperately to gather intelligence about our preparedness and our capability to defend our country." He continued, "The military personnel have from time to time violated our borders and actually entered upon our soil. They have been engaged in a flurry of military maneuvers and activities contiguous to our borders. The squandering of oil money on such activities cannot convert a baseless and immoral claim to a legitimate and just one, but it puts a heavy burden on our resources and diverts from our developmental purpose. Countering the Venezuelan threat has an absolute priority claim to our time, energy, and resources," unquote. It must also be a priority today. I have quoted Frank Hope at length, but I do not take a delight in making quotations. But he struck on themes which are relevant to us today, such as economic aggression, the threat to our developmental purposes, and the need to harness our collective energies to oppose Venezuela's, themes to which I soon return after I conclude the narrative. Mr. Speaker, the story of the adoption of the good officer process must be told. After the protocol came to an end, a new mechanism had to be found to replace it. The UN played an active role. When the UN Secretary General dispatched personal representatives in the person of Diego Cordovez and Morales Paul to determine what the next step would be in the territorial controversy. In this exercise, they were aided by the brilliant written and oral intervention of Foreign Minister Rashli Jackson, Attorney General Mohammed Shahabuddin, who often acted as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Noel Sinclair, and the strategic direction of President Burnham. As a result, Guyana and Venezuela agreed to the good officers process. Yet even as this unfolded, Venezuela still tried through such concepts as globality and an environmental treaty to get its hands on the execrable. It continued to issue threats to investors, which began in 1966, continued with their opposition to the Upper Mazaruni hydroelectric scheme, and continues to this day. Economic aggression has become an art form, and Caracas has squashed such ventures as the Beale deal and aggressively opposed the sale of oil blocks and threatened oil companies who are illegitimately exploiting our petroleum resources in our maritime space. But as Mr. Hope had warned, we will have to devote our energies towards defending our nation and preventing a disruption of our developmental process. I believe all of those are valid today. It was recognized that after approximately 26 years, despite the excellent efforts of the good officers and the facilitators and the enhanced good officer process, no solution has been found to the territorial controversy, which has been a bugbear to our national development. In the circumstance, there was no other sensible option than to request the United Nations Secretary General to refer the matter to the International Court of Justice. The nation knows that the UN Secretary General acceded to this request, and the matter is now before the World Court. Mr. Speaker, I said before that Venezuela does not honor international agreements solemnly arrived at. I add to this its disregard for international institutions. It has now added the ICJ to that. Having agreed to the referral of the territorial controversy to the ICJ, it embarked on its obstructive tactics. At first, it signaled its intention not to be involved in the judicial process. And then it claimed that the ICJ had no jurisdiction to hear the case involving the validity of the 1899 award. The ICJ did rule on the 18th of December 2022 that it has such jurisdiction. In a quandary, Caracas then filed a preliminary objections to the ICJ proceedings to dealing with the merits of the case. Success did not attend those efforts either. We have arrived at the point where Venezuela, through the device of a referendum, is seeking to make a naked attempt to annex the Essequibo. This is a dangerous moment in our history. We must be united in the face of this new phase of aggression. I do not think this will be an aggression as in the past. President Maduro is in the coils of sharp economic problems, which has led to the exodus of thousands of citizens, and thus the decline of his economy and his popularity in Venezuela. The referendum and the mobilizing of troops on our border by Maduro administration is an attempt to regain popularity and appease a volatile people and end the apparent erosion among his political bases. This is a dangerous game. What happens if Maduro gets the yes vote, which he and his top officials are campaigning for? What does he do before or after he wins the election next year? He might decide to take direct military action using a potential fifth column in our midst. Whatever happens in this neighboring state, we must be prepared. This opportunity must be taken to condemn the attempt by Venezuela to withdraw from the judicial process under the guise of a referendum. The peaceful settlement of the controversy demands that Venezuela adhere to international law and mores. Permit me to also register our support for the decision to approach the ICJ for provisional measures against the convening of that sinister referendum. I should inform the House that the President did engage me, and I quietly gave him a written document supporting these measures. We now publicly support it here. A central theme in the narrative I just outlined is the unity Guyana has shown over the years. That unity has often been expressed in parliamentary committees, and it may be right and appropriate to single out those Guyanese who supported this nation at a critical moment of its history by serving on those committees. I refer to such men as Boise Ramkaran, Marcellus Fielden Singh, and our own Kamiram Surup, among others. I am also not above praising the PPP for steadfast but sometimes qualified support on the border controversy. On this we have done well as a nation. Now we must summon the will and steel ourselves for yet another challenge from Venezuela. I offer the coalition support for this resolution. We have already taken steps to prove our seriousness in this matter by issuing a joint statement with the government, a statement which we carefully crafted. We have a caveat. It is, we urge the government to put the question of the education of this population on this matter on a permanent basis. We believe that there has to be continuous permanent education as it relates to this matter. The territorial controversy must be in our schools, studied by our academics at the university, must be part of the discussion of the trade unions, NGOs, the private sector, and with every segment of our society, regardless of which political party is in power. In this regard, we wish to recommend the formation of a non-partisan and non-political commission on which experts can sit and offer recommendation on this vital question. It is one of the few issues we didn't agree on in the discussions, but I believe it is necessary to state it here. The handiwork of the state and society we have fashioned over many long years must endure. In the 1980s, Dr. Ptolemy Reed, the then Prime Minister who was born in the Essequibo, stood before the podium of the United Nations and declared that if Venezuela had its way, he would become a refugee in his own land. Dr. Reed is not alone in this. If Caracas has its way with our land, we will become refugees of one kind or another. Now is the time to reject Venezuela's claim to our land and declare once more that the 1899 arbitral award is valid. And it defined our border with Venezuela. And that this has been recognized by all appropriate international organizations, including the United Nations. We also believe that the restatement to our commitment to the sanctity of treaties, the peaceful resolution of dispute between states, and the peaceful development of nations will be in order on this occasion. I also wish to add my voice to Amanza's contribution and voice deal on the question of migrants. We do believe that there is need for a structured system for us to deal with migrants so that they do not become a burden to us. And I will ask the government to make a commitment that Guyana comes first and that no migrant who isn't entitled to a birth certificate and citizenship, we must ensure that they do not get it. That will be a great signal of our unity. I recommend a halting of documents to Venezuelans, and let us put a proper register and system to evaluate each applicant, screen and monitor their activities. It will be naive of us to believe that Venezuela will not send its agents into Guyana. Mr. Speaker, it will be remiss of me if I take my seat without thanking and praising those governments and organizations which have come out in support of our territorial integrity and sovereignty. It is particularly comforting to have the EU states, the US, CARICOM, the OAS, stating their commitment to a peaceful resolution of the territorial controversy. And it would be equally remiss in my duty if I did not at the same time praise the Guyana Defense Force, the Guyana Police Force, and all Guyanese who have over the years offered their services and worked with the government of Guyana to oppose Venezuelan aggression against our state. I mean every soldier, every constable, those who might have stood a lonely guard at Ittering Band, and those who might have had to make sacrifices to serve. We should respect them and honor their sacrifices. For those who went to Ittering Band, they will know it cannot be an easy thing spending life there. And so these ordinary soldiers, these ordinary policemen deserve our support and our commendation. The nation must thank them. I also must not forget the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which over the duration of our history has worked sometimes beyond the call of duty to defend this country of ours. Mr. Speaker, before I close, there are 2 points I want to make. The resolution is clear, and I want to read. In 4 it says, supports the government in its pursuit to ensure a peaceful and lawful resolution of the controversy before the International Court of Justice and reject the proposal to return to any form of dialogue with Venezuela on the controversy outside of the process before the court. I raise this because I raised with my good friend and villager, the Prime Minister, that I don't think it is appropriate for us to say we will have no dialogue with Venezuela. This language was carved to establish that we will not dialogue on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial controversy, which is before. But as people running a government, you can never close the door totally to. Well, it's not the first time you're wrong. So, that was in light of it now. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it is our task to rally all Guyanese in support of this country. But I would not be truthful to myself if I say I believe the government is doing everything necessary. I think there is need for more action. I think there is need for more public education. I think there is need for the more involvement of our people. Our people will only be with us if we involve them. And so I want to stress that. And to conclude by saying, the government has, the people of Guyana have our full support for this resolution, as I close by saying every inch of this territory belongs to us, and I do believe we will make the reality of Dave Martin's song not one blade of grass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Leader of the Opposition.